What are you eating tonight? Chances are what you're eating will be the last thing you can afford this month. Because in just the past few weeks, America has lost up to 94% of its agricultural export output, followed by the unbelievable collapse of 4 massive farms once responsible for feeding millions of Americans each day. Texas is flooded. Washington State has lost its entire cherry crop. Iowa and the Dakotas are drowning in surplus and bank debt. Stores are starting to run empty, and food prices are skyrocketing. What led to this crisis? And amid the hardship, a statement from President Trump is forcing many to ask, who is actually being protected? Don't look away. This isn't just a story about farmers. Watch the video to discover 4 mega farms if you still care about meals, bills, and America's future. Number 1. King Ranch, Texas, July 4th, 2025. Texas didn't celebrate Independence Day. They were counting cow carcasses. King Ranch, the largest private ranch in the U.S. with over 170 years of history, officially declared bankruptcy after an unprecedented flood in South Texas. Thousands of cattle were swept away in floodwaters, corn and cotton silos destroyed, and the transportation infrastructure shattered, just like the faith of those who had lived off this land for generations. But don't think it started with the rain. The flood wasn't the cause. It was merely the final blow to a body already crumbling. There was a time when King Ranch stood for the American cowboy dream, a land of 825,000 acres larger than the entire state of Rhode Island, supporting thousands of families producing millions of pounds of beef, annually exporting to Mexico, Japan, and Europe. This ranch was once the pride of the state, featured in textbooks as a symbol of Western pioneering spirit. Every harvest season, trucks lined up loaded with corn, cotton, and beef, all proudly bearing the brand of America. But those days are gone. Since early 2025, a series of beef export contracts to Japan and the EU were rejected due to shifting import standards and trade tensions. These markets switched to buying from Canada, where beef is considered more tender, less antibiotic-laden, and more strictly inspected. By May 2025, frozen beef shipments from King Ranch were repeatedly returned. Mexico, its primary market, closed borders in retaliation to Washington's tariff policies. Beef prices plummeted. Domestically fuel and livestock feed subsidies were abruptly cut under the flowery name Big Beautiful Bill, a law signed in June 2025 aimed at restructuring the budget. The result: skyrocketing input costs, agricultural insurance disappeared, and commercial loans were pulled as banks saw too much risk. King Ranch began bleeding money. Then at the end of June 2025, rain poured over Texas for 3 straight days. Water surged from hill country, flooding King Ranch's pastures, washing away hundreds of tons of unharvested corn. Cattle couldn't be evacuated in time as the internal alert system failed, and NOAA no longer had enough staff to issue timely forecasts after budget cuts. The flood struck while people were still clinging to what hadn't been mortgaged. Estimated damage over $200 million. But what wasn't counted how many families lost jobs, how many towns lost their food distribution centers, and how many supermarket chains in Texas, once proud of being a self-sustaining agricultural state, now must import frozen meat from elsewhere. Beef prices in Houston supermarkets jumped nearly 40% in just 3 weeks. In Corpus Christi, many schools cut red meat from meals due to budget shortfalls. Smaller farms around King Ranch also announced closures one by one as they depended on shared distribution infrastructure. One domino fell and the entire southern U.S. food system trembled. You may not live in Texas, but you've eaten beef at a restaurant somewhere or held a tray of red meat at Walmart without knowing where it came from. Now look again for some reason that beef has disappeared or changed labels. In Florida, red meat prices rose 17% in 2 weeks. In Arizona, many supermarkets reduced meat package sizes, but kept prices the same. On the East Coast, restaurants are switching to imported Australian beef tougher gamir, but with no other choice. But the real pain isn't in those numbers. It's in the eyes of the Texans, people who once believed that agriculture was sacred, that land and labor should be protected, not managed with spreadsheets. They look toward Washington and ask if the forecast system's budget hadn't been cut. If NOAA hadn't lost staff earlier this year, would they have received earlier warnings? Would the flood have still come like a thief in the night? They know the answer is yes. But even now, their voices cannot reach the halls of power where debates continue over which agency is to blame and which line item can be cut next. They don't matter as much as the numbers in the draft budget. And the very real consequences, lost cattle, lost land, lost food supply, remain secondary to meetings full of jargon. In the smaller farms around King Ranch, people are starting to sell off machinery land and hope. They no longer wait for a bailout, because they understand when all anyone cares about is restructuring the survival of a farm or a community no longer ranks as a priority. Bordering states like Louisiana, Oklahoma, and New Mexico are also feeling the aftermath. Transport routes, severed wholesale markets short on supply, many food transfer hubs forced to shut down. Countless gas stations lacking biofuel once sourced from King Ranch corn, causing disruptions in logistics chains. One ranch fell, but the entire region lost control. Texans aren't just angry, they're exhausted. Exhausted from beautiful promises like the law named Big Beautiful Bill, which silently dismantled the very networks that once protected farmers. Exhausted from being forced into free competition in a system where the winners own AI infrastructure and the losers still milk cows by hand at dawn. And most of all, exhausted by the fact that when it all collapses, no one is held accountable. A former employee at the ranch said he filed for emergency relief but never received a response. In an open letter, he wrote he doesn't blame God, just regrets that the warning signs were ignored for too long. And he's not alone, because after King Ranch, another farm is also preparing to bow out. Schultz Family Farms, the largest corn and soybean farm in Iowa, once dubbed the heart of America's Corn Belt, has announced they can no longer maintain the 2025 crop season. No flood, just debt. And the silence of those who once promised to make American agriculture great again. Number 2, Schultz Family Farms, Iowa. The second story has nothing to do with natural disasters. They fell because of something more invisible. Trust had dried up, cash flow had died, and a system they once bled to build had now turned its back. This farm used to be Iowa's pride, a vital link in the global agricultural supply chain. From here, corn and soybeans were shipped everywhere. Ethanol plants, livestock feed mixers, ports that carried them to Germany and Japan. But that was in the days when markets still listened to farmers. Now no one listens and no one buys. In Q2 of 2025, corn prices dropped to just $4.22 per bushel, lower than the production cost of $4.80. Fertilizer imported from Canada and pesticides from Brazil rose 30-40% after the US imposed new tariffs under the Big Beautiful Bill. Seasonal loan interest hit 9%. These numbers didn't need to scream. They choked slowly long enough for those involved to understand no miracle was coming. Meanwhile, Europe tightened GMO imports. Contracts Schultz had signed with German and Dutch importers canceled. They turned to Canada, not because they hated America, but because Canadian corn was traceable. The new seeds met standards, the storage process was certified. Schultz knew. They had read every line in the new standard. But to switch seeds to upgrade infrastructure, they needed financing. And money was what they no longer had. They didn't sit still. Schultz launched a campaign to rescue domestic produce, urging consumers in and out of state to buy their corn and soybeans. They held fairs, offered discounts, opened up their storage. Flyers were handed out at local markets. The farm shared quality data on social media. But once people heard Europe had returned, the good suspicion grew. If it didn't meet European standards, who dared eat it? Even domestic processors turned away. And they turned to Canadian corn. They couldn't sell to anyone. They couldn't wait any longer. The longer they waited, the more they lost. June sunshine poured over still green fields, but no one wanted to harvest. The grain dryers sat idle. The storage was shut. Eventually, Schultz had to choose destroy the season. Part of the field was burned. No one filmed it. No one spoke up. It wasn't an event, just another day in a year that was too long. Meanwhile, the machines began to turn on them. The S770 harvester lay dead at the field's edge. A simple software bug, but only a John Deere technician was allowed to touch the system. They called. They waited. A week later, someone arrived. The software fix cost over $4,000. Schultz had no choice. John Deere held a monopoly on repairs. The FTC and several states had filed lawsuits, but lawsuits didn't help harvest corn. Every day the machine sat idle meant tens of thousands of dollars lost. And while that happened, John Deere reported billions in profit. The real farmers were left pleading for repair permits on machines they had bought brand new. Schultz saw what was coming, but they still tried. They applied for seed switching aid from the Modern Farm Act. They proposed cleaner farming models, invited quality inspectors. But all they got was delay. The funds were never dispersed. Promises made in 2023 remained on paper. And while they waited for policy, the bank came first. When costs exceed revenue, when there's no credit left, no contracts, they had no choice. Peter Schultz sent a final email to his partners. "We will not plant in the 2025 season. Thank you for your trust. No call for help. No outrage. Just the end. No TV coverage. No politician was questioned. People still ate imported canned corn 15% more expensive than last year. Still bought soy from faraway lands. No one mentioned Schultz at the Nottingham Agricultural Fair, but that whole stretch of land and the thousands of jobs tied to it was gone. If you've never lived in Iowa, maybe you can't feel that loss. But if you've ever eaten pork from Illinois, drunk milk from Wisconsin, seen U.S. corn on a supermarket label, then part of the food chain you still rely on today once passed through Schultz family farms. And when a farm like that has to burn its fields to destroy crops, the scary part isn't that they lost land, it's that America is losing its ability to feed itself. When Schultz collapsed, the first to feel it weren't exporters or politicians. It was the industrial feedlots in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, where hundreds of thousands of pigs, chickens, and dairy cows depended on cheap corn and soy from Iowa. They called their suppliers. Silence on the other end. The shipment was canceled, no new delivery schedule, and no one else to call. Feed became scarce immediately. Some factories had to suspend operations. Meat delivery contracts were delayed. Retail chains in Milwaukee, Columbus, even Memphis began limiting orders not because meat ran out, but because prices rose and supply shrank. Consumers didn't see empty shelves, but they saw smaller meat trays, more labels saying Origin Brazil, and prices 25% higher in just a few weeks. At small family farms, rising feed costs meant livestock herds became unsustainable. Some reduced headcount. Others quietly liquidated. No one called it a crisis, but it crept into every layer of the food system: less protein in school meals, fewer donations at food banks, higher costs for families already struggling. Schultz wasn't the only link, but they were the most stable one. When that link snapped, the whole chain felt the jolt. And the system, massive in scale but hollow in resilience, revealed its flaw: it wasn't built to adapt. It only works when everything follows the old playbook. There was a time when America proudly exported crops to feed the world. But when a central state like Iowa no longer grows for its own country, supermarkets import corn from Argentina, soybeans from Paraguay, canned beans from China. Even popcorn in Chicago theaters changed origin, and no one asked why. Number 3, RD Offet Farms, North Dakota. The sorrowful summer in North Dakota didn't arrive with a storm. RD Offet Farms, a potato empire that once reached dozens of countries, is quietly sliding downward. They didn't need to make headlines. No press releases. The market understood. When containers of frozen potatoes sat still in Fargo for over 90 days with no new export orders, no bankruptcy declaration was needed. Reality had spoken. Since the 1990s, Offet symbolized America's global agricultural ambition. With over 60,000 acres, advanced cold storage systems, and close ties with McDonald's, Wendy's, and food importers across Asia, they turned potatoes into a tool of soft diplomacy. Potatoes from North Dakota once graced fast food trays in Japan, South Korea. Saudi Arabia, Mexico, countries that once saw American flavor as a value. Then things started to crack, not from a storm, but a wave on social media. Viral TikTok videos in Japan showed fries with strange odors at McDonald's. A major Tokyo restaurant chain announced it would stop using U.S. potatoes due to chemical residues exceeding limits. They didn't name names, but Offet was quickly brought up. No proof needed, suspicion was enough. Back in the U.S., things weren't better. Wendy's, Burger King, and smaller chains received quality complaints: soggy fries, greasy batches, odd tastes. In leaked internal reports, people began citing supply inconsistency, and tracing the chain led back to North Dakota. Faith in U.S. potatoes, once the gold standard, began to erode. International companies needed a fast solution. They looked across the border. Canada, especially Alberta and Manitoba, with major investments in disease-resistant potato varieties and modern storage tech, became the ideal choice. Cold containers quietly crossed the border. No ads, no fanfare. Just this: America fell short. Canada was ready. What hurt Offet most wasn't being replaced. It was how American consumers embraced the replacement, so casually. Online people said Canadian fries were crispier, less oily, easier on the stomach. A Chicago food blogger wrote, "First time I've eaten fast food and not felt guilty." Millions of shares. No one mentioned Offet, but everyone understood. In home kitchens, frozen potato bags from Ontario and Manitoba began taking over. Sharp-eyed shoppers traced the origin codes. In supermarkets, Canadian potatoes were shelved equally, sometimes more prominently. And while the McDonald's logo and Burger King's red and gold remained the product inside, once a symbol of American flavor, was now Canadian grown. American consumer habits are shifting quietly but deeply. They still love fast food, but want it cleaner, less greasy, safer. The so-called guilty pleasure now needs to come with less guilt. They're cooking at home more, and in their freezers, US, potatoes are no longer the default. What saddened many wasn't that Canadian fries were better, but that they hadn't been told. No one announced the supply change. No one mentioned Offet, a pillar of American agriculture, was in freefall. It all happened silently, as if collective shame could vanish if no one noticed. But memory doesn't fade so easily. Once US produce was proudly the best in the world. Offet shipments were once welcomed at Yokohama Port, once set the standard for upscale restaurants in Seoul. Now, as partners turn to Canada and Northern Europe, even basics like logistics contracts and agricultural credit are becoming difficult. Offet once believed they'd endure by size, by tradition, by trust. But by 2025, the game changed. Trade agreements between Canada and the EU and between Canada and Japan brought advantages the US couldn't match. While US produce faced high tariffs and strict inspections, Canada was seen as greener, more reliable. Old partners walked away. A Korean conglomerate said bluntly, "We need stability," and the US no longer provides it. Offet wanted to switch seed varieties, invest in tech, but they were trapped after the 2024 credit crunch. Their aid applications were frozen. Containers waited. Cold storage burned electricity. And every logistical link began to fail. There was no official announcement, but everyone knew. Americans long used to familiar flavors began noticing something different in their meals, though no one said it out loud. The brands were still American, but the taste wasn't anymore. And perhaps the question is no longer, what are we eating, but do we even control what we're eating anymore? In North Dakota, reefer truck drivers have changed routes. Fargo is now just a pit stop. The destination is Winnipeg is Saskatchewan. On the export map, a potato-shaped hole is growing. When American fast food is made with Canadian ingredients, when US families eat Canadian goods unknowingly, maybe fast food is being redefined and Canada is buying it back one fry at a time. We don't complain because the quality is bad. We even eat better. But is it worth it for an entire agricultural empire to fade just because it couldn't change fast enough? Or because we didn't realize that what's being taken isn't just potatoes, but identity? And if a monument like Offet can collapse in silence, who's next? Perhaps somewhere out west where red earth and fruit once put America on the world's table, another name is waiting its turn. Let's guess who's the last name on this list. Number 4, Steml Growers, Washington. You might think of cherries as just a summer fruit sweet, easy to eat, overflowing on Costco shelves every July. But in the summer of 2025 in Wenatchee, the fruit capital of America, every cherry began to ripen in a different way, silently, rapidly, and desperately. It wasn't because of the weather. There were no storms, no frost. The trees were still heavy with fruit. But in a year that seemed favorable, the largest family-owned fresh fruit exporter in the US, Steml Growers, faced collapse from an entirely unexpected cause, the absence of people. Steml had long been an agricultural icon of Washington state. With nearly 60 years of history, over 1,500 steady employees and products distributed in more than 20 countries, it wasn't just a company, it was part of Wenatchee's identity. They exported cherries, apples, pears, peaches, year-round with some of the highest quality standards in the world. But this year, just 2 weeks into cherry season, their orchards began falling into a strange state. Cherries ripened en masse, but no one was picking. Less than 50% of seasonal labor arrived in the area, most of whom used to come from California. But this season, many chose to stay home. There were no strikes declared, no banners hung. They simply stopped showing up. Rumors of ICE waiting at rest stops or lurking near interstate routes spread rapidly. No one saw it with their own eyes. But the fear was real, and for those who had traveled hundreds of miles to pick fruit, that fear was enough to keep them home. A manager named Carlos said his orchard needed at least 60 workers, but only had 35. Not enough to save the fruit, and cherries are not like corn or wheat. They don't wait. Once ripe and not picked in time, they spoil, cannot be stored, cannot be frozen. The only option left is to discard them. The cost of hiring legal labor under the H-2A program continues to rise, not to mention new regulations requiring employers to provide housing, transportation, and living support, pushing the real wage up to over $20 per hour. But even when Steml agreed to pay that price, there was no one to hire. They simply stopped showing up. Meanwhile, export markets began pulling out of contracts. Japan was the first, then Korea, followed by Middle Eastern countries. No official announcements were made, but within the contract documents, the reasons were clear: inconsistent quality, unreliable delivery times, high spoilage rates. Shipments were returned not for chemical violations or standard breaches, but simply because they arrived late. Hundreds of tons of cherries, apples, and peaches were crushed into juice for the domestic market, sold for less than the cost of harvest. Domestic supermarkets offered no relief. Walmart didn't raise its purchase prices, and Costco didn't open more storage. Some retail chains even cut back on buying fresh goods from Washington state, switching instead to in-state supply chains in California and Oregon, where labor was still sufficient to maintain harvest schedules. Amid the chaos, Steml tried to hold on. They tried extending cherry shelf life by misting for 72 hours, increasing cold chain capacity, and shifting harvest schedules to nighttime to take advantage of cooler temperatures. But the results were negligible. Production costs rose nearly 15% in just 3 weeks, while revenue dropped by almost 40%. And the worst was yet to come. In the 4th week of the season, some Steml cherry containers were rejected at port for internal mold, something that only appears if the fruit is slightly scratched, then left too long during the wait. There were no embargoes, no major political events, but for an export supply chain, that was enough of a death knell. And as a natural consequence, on July 2nd, 2025, Steml Growers officially declared bankruptcy. Not the loud kind of bankruptcy with lawsuits or financial scandal. They filed under the federal restructuring program, transferring asset management to the court. A single press release was issued. No press conference, no finger-pointing, no blame. Just a simple admission. We are no longer able to operate at international market standards. For those who had spent a lifetime with Steml, that was more painful than any disaster. Because no one expected the end to come so quietly. There were no machines being dismantled. No ambulances. No executives arrested. Just branches sagging with cherries, cold storage lights slowly turning off, and workers standing at the edge of the orchard watching the last ripe fruit fall to the ground, untouched. Perhaps Steml was the only farm to withdraw with dignity. They didn't take on more debt, didn't keep going just in case while hoping for a miracle. They saw it clearly: without stable labor, without international contracts, without the ability to control output quality, the worst outcome wasn't losing money. It was dragging down an entire fruit-growing region. The death of Steml marked the end of an era, a time when American agriculture thrived on exports, on the image of high-tech farmers on crates crossing oceans under the American flag, but also a time entirely dependent on migrant labor, on complex immigration policies, on supply chains, so fragile a mere rumor could take down an entire season. Cherries, considered refined, premium, delicate, were the first to fall. And if cherries couldn't survive, how much longer could apples, grapes, or almonds hold on, with the last of 4 mega farms declaring bankruptcy? Perhaps the question is no longer which farm will fall next, but after they're all gone, how will America farm? Because in the shadows left by these massive farms, new signs are beginning to appear. Smaller, more local, quieter, and perhaps more viable. No longer chasing the dream of export farming, but turning to practicality, growing to feed the community, reducing dependence, and slowly regaining control. No one yet knows if this trend can support a fractured agricultural system. But after Steml, no one dares believe anymore that growing big means lasting long. Let's now look at the consequences that have spread to other states, perhaps even where you live, and the trends that may unfold in the future. And what happens after these 4 mega farms collapse? If you thought the recent bankruptcy of 4 mega farms was a rare anomaly, maybe it's time we take another look. Not to panic, but to prepare. Because after names like King Ranch and Offet, what will stop the wave from continuing? Just imagine when collection stations shut down when processing plants close because there's no more supply. How long can the nearby small farms, which rely on that infrastructure, survive? You don't need a drought or a flood, just a few unsigned contracts and an entire farming zone can vanish from the agricultural map. And if family farms begin to give up, who will take over? Certainly not the children who grew up there. They've either left or no longer have the capital to hold on to the land. Maybe it will be some corporation stepping in at the right moment with a suitcase of budget and a global supply chain ready. Maybe from Canada, as we've seen before, or maybe somewhere else. At that point, crops will still be grown. Corned beef, fruit, all still here. But are you sure that what you're eating is grown for your needs or because a contract was signed with a market half a world away? And then when a few corporations grow large enough to control most of the market, do you think they'll still feel the need to keep prices consumer-friendly? Or will they set prices in the only way you'll have no choice but to accept, because there's no competition left? It may sound far-fetched, but if you've seen how food prices have skyrocketed in recent years, that future may not be so distant. It already began yesterday. We just didn't notice in time. Some will say as long as there's food and it's still cheaper than in Europe, it's fine, but others won't swallow it so easily. They'll look at the fields where their grandparents once grew rice, now bearing signs of foreign ownership, and ask, is this still American agriculture? That question might start echoing across regions, not just among farmers, but even those living hundreds of miles from any field. Because when the supply chain breaks, they'll feel it too. The vegetables no longer fresh, the meat no longer cheap, and even the deliveries no longer regular. And that's just the surface. When people begin to realize they no longer control what's on their own dinner plate, their first response might be to go small. Local farmers markets might get busier. Some families might start growing veggies in their backyards. Some may choose to leave the city and return to the land, not to get rich, but to live without dependency. Some politicians might start questioning who should be allowed to own farmland. They might call for limits on foreign investors or revive support programs for farmers that had been cut. But if they act too late, those efforts might just be like patching a boat that's long since sunk. So if you've ever thought, what do a few collapsing mega farms have to do with me? You might soon realize it has everything to do with your meals, your cost of living, and the future of what we once called Made in America. And if no one farms for America anymore, then maybe one day we'll find ourselves importing the agricultural dream from someone else's hands. A nation can go without producing cars, can import steel, and even borrow energy from another country. But a nation cannot survive if it loses the very ability to feed its own people. American agriculture is now fracturing from within. When the 4 largest farms declare bankruptcy within just a few months, it is no longer a warning, it is a crisis. No one imagined that one day, King Ranch with its 170-year legacy would sink under floodwaters and bank debt. No one pictured Schultz Farms, the symbol of corn and soybeans, being auctioned off as a bad loan. Then Offet's potatoes were blocked at the border due to European standards, and Steml lost its labor force because of tightened immigration policies. Piece by piece, America's agricultural pie is falling apart, and the final piece may be the everyday meal on the table. This video does not advocate for the division of the United States or promote secession. All content is presented for the purpose of exploration, analysis, and sparking discussion based on current events, sentiments, and social trends. We respect the Constitution of the United States and all federal regulations.